Hello everyone. Please make yourself comfortable. We have another long trip to the past on our menu tonight. More than 2000 years ago, the Romans captured, sacked and completely demolished a city that had once threatened their very existence, Carthage. After many battles, over more than a century, the last Phoenician bastion in the world was no more, and a page of history was turned. Carthage was located in North Africa, in modern Tunisia, and it had been one of the largest, most advanced and most influential cities of the ancient world. But its history had started far from the shores of Tunisia, and long before Rome even existed, far to the east, in the Levant. This is the page of history we are going to explore tonight. You certainly heard of Phoenicia, an ancient civilization from the Middle East, oriented towards the sea, that dominated trade in this part of the world 3000 years ago, and founded colonies all around the Mediterranean Sea, including Carthage. The Phoenicians keep many mysteries. For a long time they were considered almost a lost civilization because of the relative lack of written records about them. We will see why. But that's a paradox because the Phoenicians made many contributions to the advancement of culture and techniques. They had the world's oldest known alphabet. They did not invent writing, but as far as we know, they were some of the first to write words made of letters, as opposed to writing systems based on ideograms, like the Egyptian hieroglyphs, for example. They influenced the Hebrew, Arabic, and Greek alphabets, and in turn the Latin alphabet that we use all the time. But this is just one thing among many others we will discuss tonight. I will also tell you of their origins, their culture, their religion, how ancient trade worked, the founding of cities and colonies, and of course the Epic of Carthage. So please sit or lie down. And this story is also made to help you relax or fall asleep. So don't hesitate to close your eyes whenever you feel like it. You can always return later, thanks to the timestamps. If you like it better, you can also listen to my stories on audio streaming sites like Spotify or Apple Music. There is a link for that in the first comment pinned under this video. Especially if you like ancient history, you will find an audio story about the Library of Alexandria that I recently made specifically for audio streaming. So it is not on YouTube, and I know it can be slightly annoying to not find everything in one place. But I would very much like to be less dependent on YouTube, and audio streaming platforms are a good alternative. Another alternative, and one where you can find everything I do, is Patreon, if you wish to become a patron of this channel. On Patreon you can listen to every story with and without background sounds. You can download all audios and videos. You get regular updates. There is also a link to Patreon in the pinned comment. But what really matters right now is that you enjoy the upcoming story. So take a deep breath, exhale, and let's begin our journey to the past. Around the 12th century BC, more than 3,000 years ago, in the Middle East, in Southeast Europe and North Africa, there was a time of economic, political and urban collapse for several powerful and ancient cultures. This sudden change, this event, is called the Late Bronze Age collapse, and it affected different civilizations at the same time. Some survived, but were very weakened, like Egypt and its new kingdom, or the Assyrian Empire from Mesopotamia. Others collapsed, like the empire of the Hittites from Anatolia and the Levant in modern Turkey and Syria. In Greece, the ancient Greek culture called Mycenaean Greece, I told you about it in various stories already, was also very affected. Large cities and towns that were the centers of the economy declined dramatically, and life became organized around small, isolated villages. This lasted for several centuries, a period that has been called the Greek Dark Ages, before Greece began a cultural rebirth, rebuilt its cities, and developed the classical culture that made it so influential. The reasons for this late Bronze Age collapse are not very well known. There are multiple possible explanations, including volcanic eruptions, droughts, changes in military technology, because iron working would have begun to appear at this time, possibly invasions or migrations, most probably wars too, and maybe a combination of these different reasons. But what we know is that suddenly, over 3 or 4 decades, states and cultures that were flourishing in this part of the world all declined at the same time. I am telling you this because even though the late Bronze Age collapse was a leap backward, it was also a transition phase, and new cultures or new peoples emerged from it, either because they were liberated from the dominance of others, or they were better adapted to the new times that were beginning. And this was the case of the Phoenicians, as the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Anatolians, or the Greeks that surrounded their region of origin were losing their political structures and were becoming unable to project their influence, their culture, their trade, or their armies. The Phoenicians rose to prominence. For about 1,000 years, with periods of expansion and decline, their maritime network would spread all around the Mediterranean Sea and make them some of the most skilled and wealthiest merchants and mariners of the antiquity. So it is during this period of the 12th century BC that the Phoenicians rose as an advanced, independent civilization and original society. They benefited from the decline of their neighbors, that they were there long before, in a coastal region that was centered on modern Lebanon and extended to Israel, to Palestine, to the south, and Syria, to the north. The Phoenicians belonged to a group of people called Canaanites, the peoples that lived in Canaan, a term familiar to readers of the Bible. But what is Canaan exactly? Canaan was at the same time the name of a region that corresponds to the Levant, that is to say, the stretch of land or the land bridge between Africa and Eurasia. The term Levant was defined in Europe in the Middle Ages to name a region with unprecise limits to the east. It means literally where the sun rises. There was a time when the term included Egypt, Turkey, or even Greece. But in the past couple of centuries, or in archaeology, its definition was limited to the stretch of land between Egypt and Turkey. In Arabic, there is a similar term, al-Mashriq, the Mashriq, meaning the eastern place where the sun rises. But the definition of the Arabic Mashriq is wider. It encompasses the entire Arab Middle East, the eastern part of the Arab world. So Canaan, as it appears in the Bible, corresponds to the southern Levant that provides the main settings of biblical narratives, the land of Israel, Philistia, a confederation of cities, and Phoenicia, among others. The term Canaanite, to name the inhabitants of Canaan, is like a catch-all term, because it was not a single country, not even a single ethnic group. For example, it is believed that the Philistines, the inhabitants of Philistia, were a people of Indo-European origin that had similarities with the Mycenaean civilization of Greece. They arrived and settled at the time of the late Bronze Age collapse. But still, Canaanites are considered a relevant category because they populated the same region. There was a lot of overlap between populations. There were reciprocal cultural influences, and their languages belonged to the same family of Semitic languages. And in the 2 or 3 centuries before the late Bronze Age collapse, Canaan, the southern Levant, became the region where the spheres of influence of powerful empires from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Anatolia, the Hittites, converged and overlapped. They all fought for it, first because they wanted to expand and secure their frontiers, second because Canaan was a crossroads and it gave access to trade with other regions, and also because of its resources. In particular, the north, what is modern Lebanon and would be called Phoenicia, had forests that could provide logs, timber for shipmaking, or monuments and palaces. The Egyptians and Mesopotamians lacked this resource, whereas Phoenicia had plenty of native cedar wood that was very sought after. So they all tried to secure trade with cities of Phoenicia that could sell timber, or even better, submit them. In the 15th century BC, these cities were under Egyptian influence. The cities were independent from one another, and the largest and most influent at the time was Byblos. But there were also Sidon, Tyre, Beirut, which made them easier prey for foreign powers because they were very small states. In the 14th century BC, the Hittites captured Phoenician cities, especially in the north, and Egypt lost its coastal holdings. But despite these recurrent wars in which they were at stake, Phoenician cities managed to prosper during this period. They processed and exported cedar wood. They could support large populations because they had a temperate climate and the land was fertile. And they also played on their central position between powerful and wealthy empires to become centers of trade and also centers of craft. Byblos, for example, became a center for bronze making. The region was nearing the Iron Age, but bronze was still by far the most used type of metal. The city received precious goods such as tin and lapis lazuli that it transformed, and it managed to keep a degree of autonomy. It was not annexed by anyone. Other cities like Tyre and Sidon did the same. They were independent from one another and rival. Despite being culturally very close, each one had its small territory, and they didn't form, they actually never formed a single state. And then came the late Bronze Age collapse. That was disastrous for many civilizations in the region, but not for Phoenician cities. Quite the opposite, actually. Maybe because they were small city-states, it was easier for them to stay united. And also the weakening or disappearance of their neighbors left a vacuum that they could fill. They became the only maritime and mercantile powers in the region, a status they would maintain for several centuries. And they also helped the Mediterranean economy to recover in the 11th and 10th centuries BC, after the collapse. For example, they re-established long-distance trade that had been lost between Mesopotamia and Egypt. This period of emergence as an original and independent civilization is sometimes called the Phoenician Renaissance. But instead of staying in their corner of the Mediterranean Sea, Phoenician cities became more and more outward-looking. The collapse of all main powers in the east of the Mediterranean had left them with an opportunity to expand to the west as maritime and trade powers, and they used it. The creation of Carthage and many other settlements around the Mediterranean Sea would be a consequence of this. Before we talk about Phoenician expansion and the most successful of their colonies, Carthage, let's take a look at Phoenician society and religion. Politically, I told you that the Phoenicians were never united. There were independent city-states that rarely allied, as far as we know, and they were governed by hereditary kings. The kings were considered representatives of the gods, and they carried a lot of obligations, of duties concerning religious processions and rituals. In the high spheres of society, there were also classes of nobles and merchants. We don't exactly know how separated these classes were, whether they mixed or stayed very separated. Another powerful class was priesthood, which was apparently very influential. Of course, all these people accounted for only a small percentage of the population, maybe a few hundreds per city-state, whereas the vast majority of the population worked as farmers, craftsmen, soldiers or sailors. Compared with other antique societies, the Phoenicians had a very high proportion of mariners, and their economy was totally oriented towards the sea and trade routes. From the moment they rose to prominence in the 12th and 11th centuries BC, they became the intermediaries between the various peoples that spanned the Mediterranean Sea, further and further west, until they reached the Atlantic Ocean, Morocco and Portugal. These distances were huge for the antiquity, several thousand miles, and to travel such distances they needed good ships. In the 12th century BC, they already built large merchant ships. Of course, they were helped by the abundance of cedar wood. But they became expert shipbuilders, and they introduced types of ships or innovations that lasted for the rest of the antiquity. For example, they developed the keel, the bottommost structural element on a vessel. It is a simple but very important element to stabilize ships when they travel on seas and not just follow the coastline. Centuries later, around 700 BC, they may have been the first to introduce the byreme. That is to say, a type of galley with two superimposed rows of oars on each side. Byremes were long vessels that were used as warships because they could go faster and be less dependent on the winds. So they were perfect to attack or sometimes escape from other ships. And they are also credited for later inventing the trireme, an even bigger, higher type of galley with 3 rows of oars. The Greeks copied these ships. They always had intense relations with the Phoenicians and actually began to compete with them on the sea when they recovered from the fall of the Mycenaean civilization. The Phoenicians also developed several other maritime inventions, like the amphora. This type of containers, generally made of ceramic, with a pointed bottom, that other Mediterranean cultures adopted because it was convenient to transport things by sea or land, from wine to oil to fish. Amphoras can fit tightly against each other, tied together with rope. And amphoras became a standardized measurement of volume for a very long time, until the Middle Ages 2000 years later. The Phoenicians also contributed a lot to ancient cartography. They established some of the first maps that covered the entire Mediterranean world. So they acted as intermediaries, but also sold the goods they produced. It is a constant in ancient trade powers. Together with international trade, you always find a large production of crafts and luxury goods. The Greeks also had it. I elaborated on that in the past story about the history of ceramic. I'll put a link in the description. Much later, Venice, when it was a major trade power of the Middle Ages, also was a center of production of fine crafts. International trade always stimulated a production of luxury or expensive goods with a high commercial value. For the Phoenicians there was glass-making. They did not invent glass. Glass-paste appeared centuries earlier in Mesopotamia and Egypt. But they became experts at making small glass objects, like beads and flasks. At the time, glass was an expensive material. They also exported all sorts of metalwork, of bronze, later iron and gold, ivory carving, woodwork. But the most prized Phoenician goods were fabrics. More specifically, fabrics dyed with Tyrian purple, named after the city of Tyre. The fortunes of Phoenician cities varied with time. I told you earlier that Byblos was probably the wealthiest and most influent when Phoenicia was disputed together with the rest of Canaan between their powerful neighbors before the Bronze Age collapse. But after, Byblos declined relatively, and successively Sidon and Tyre rose to become the richest and most powerful city-state of Phoenicia. It is people from Tyre who founded Carthage when the city was at the peak of its power in the 9th century BC. Tyrian purple is also something I told you about in a story about the history of colors. It is also known as Phoenician red or imperial purple. This color was very rare in fabrics and pricey in the antiquity. It was expensive because the Phoenicians had a monopoly on it, and the extraction process of the dye was very labor-intensive. It came from a particular type of marine snails, which used to be very common in coastal waters, but was exploited to extinction. Because it was expensive, hard to find, and not obtainable with any other kind of dye, this imperial purple color became a symbol of power and wealth in Greek and even more in Roman culture, and a major source of income for the Phoenicians in the first millennium BC. To complete this overview of the economy, the Phoenicians were also big producers of wine. They helped propagate its consumption all across the Mediterranean. They founded colonies near mines, like in Cyprus, which had copper, and in Sardinia, and as far west as Spain, which in the antiquity was a major source of metals for the Phoenicians and later the Romans. Spain had gold, iron, copper, tin, and lead. These colonies were generally small most of the time, no more than 1,000 inhabitants, and they worked as trading posts. The only exception, and it's a big one, would be Carthage. In general, the Phoenicians did not have the numbers or the intention to create a large empire with many territories. What motivated them when they created colonies was control of trade routes, proximity to the places where resources could be extracted or sold, and increasingly, competition with Greek cities. Greece had lost its first cities of the Mycenaean period, following the late Bronze Age collapse. The population had declined, and people in Greece, after the collapse, started living essentially in small villages. But in the first millennium BC, the Greeks progressively re-emerged as an urban civilization, also organized politically around city-states like the Phoenicians, and also very outward-looking, willing to explore the Mediterranean and establish a presence everywhere. So in the 9th, 8th, 7th centuries BC, there was a rising competition between Greek and Phoenician cities to put their flag on every corner of the Mediterranean Sea, where there could be trade to be made, and dozens of colonies were founded. The Phoenicians had more in North Africa and Spain, the Greeks in Italy, but there were places like Sicily or Crete where they had settlements that clashed sometimes. Overall, coexistence between the Phoenicians and the Greeks was peaceful, but they became commercial rivals at the time. Like for Greek colonies, the colonies of Phoenicia were fairly autonomous. Here again, there was no desire to create any kind of centralized empire. The colonies were seen as little sisters or daughters of the original city-state. These colonies were only expected, at most, to send an annual tribute to their mother city, and it was seen as a kind of religious offering. Again, Carthage, that we are going to talk about in a few minutes, became an exception. But before elaborating on Carthage, let's take a look at Phoenician religion. It is not known very well, because few sources survived, and it is not always easy to distinguish Phoenician religious beliefs and traditions from their neighbors in Canaan. What we know is that they worshipped a pantheon that included a supreme god, El, E-L, common to various Semitic cultures, and another major deity was El's son, Baal, which meant master or lord. There were other deities like Melkart or Adonis, but we don't really know whether these are different names for the same gods or if they were different entities with different local names. The most important goddess was Astarte, sometimes called Astarte, which is how the ancient Greeks named her. This goddess was related to Ishtar from Mesopotamia. Because of its importance in the history of the Mediterranean, the Phoenician civilization is often looked at under the angle of trade or maritime activities, and of course under the angle of Carthage. But the Phoenicians were also intensely religious. I told you earlier that their kings were also religious leaders, that the priests had a strong influence, and it seems there was no clear distinction between the payment of taxes and religious offerings. Paying taxes and making offerings to the gods were ways of honoring one city and the divine in general. Phoenicians of all classes also made a lot of small votive offerings to their gods. A votive offering is the action of leaving an object in a sacred place, a temple, with no intention to recover or use it. This was widespread in ancient societies to gain favor with supernatural forces, and it still exists in various religious practices. So they offered objects, pottery vessels or small figurines, made especially to serve as votive offerings. Hundreds of these figurines have been retrieved in Phoenician ports. It is believed that rituals took place on ships before departure, and figurines or other ceramics were cast into the sea to ensure safe travels. It was not a very common practice, but it seems that child sacrifices also happened in times of despair or for certain ceremonies. This also existed among other Canaanite cultures, and it is one of the practices that were severely condemned later in the Hebrew and then Christian Bibles. The high point, the peak of Phoenician cities in the Levant, when they were independent and completely dominated trade, was between 1200 and 800 BC. They did not disappear after that, and they kept their culture and relevance in trade for several more centuries. But they started to be faced with the rise of new empires that they just didn't have the size and population to resist. And so they fell under the sway of foreign rulers who reduced their autonomy. In the 9th century BC, the Assyrians from Mesopotamia began to conquer Phoenicia, and they forced Phoenician cities to pay heavy tribute in money, in goods, and natural resources like metals and wood. A century later, all cities except Byblos and Tyre were even annexed by the Assyrians. Some cities revolted, but their rebellions were suppressed, and the Phoenicians never managed to fully recover their independence. The Assyrian Empire collapsed, but it was quickly replaced by the Babylonian Empire. And the Babylonians also put Phoenician cities under vassalage. When the Babylonian Empire crumbled, this time because of the rise of the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, the Phoenicians had lived under pressure from foreign powers for several centuries. And instead of revolting, they found agreements with the Persians. They yielded themselves to Persia so they could pay tribute and provide the Persians with a powerful fleet against a high degree of autonomy. When Persia went to war with Greek cities in the 5th century BC, the Phoenicians provided most of the Persian fleet, and culturally they kept their specificity for the entire Persian period until the 4th century BC. At this point they were still relevant in trade, but they were completely surrounded by Persian territories, and they faced tough competition from the Greeks. But on the other side of the Mediterranean Sea, a colony of Tyre, at the time the largest and wealthiest Phoenician city, had an extraordinary development. It is time to talk about Carthage. The exact date when Carthage was founded is a bit uncertain, but it was most probably by the end of the 9th century BC, at a time when Phoenician cities were at the height of their commercial importance, but already under pressure from the Assyrians that forced them to pay tribute. And this only accelerated the founding of more colonies around the Mediterranean Sea, because many people from Sidon, Byblos or Tyre, Carthage was a colony of Tyre, were willing to move to avoid paying heavy taxes to foreigners. Tyre had been very active in developing its commercial web in the western Mediterranean, especially in North Africa. At the end of it, there was Iberia, modern Spain and Portugal, with its valuable metal resources. And Tyre had also established its presence in islands like Sicily, Sardinia, and the Balearic Islands. The site of Carthage was probably chosen for several reasons. It was located in the central shore of the Gulf of Tunis, which gave it easy access to the sea. But at the same time it was shielded from violent storms that often happened in this part of the Mediterranean Sea. It was also close to the Strait of Sicily, which was strategically important because any ship that traveled between the eastern and western halves of the Mediterranean has to pass near Sicily. The Strait of Sicily is a bottleneck. On top of this good strategic location, the site had many advantages. The city was built on a kind of peninsula with a large lagoon on one side, which provided a lot of fish and a place for safe harbor. This peninsula was connected to the mainland by a single narrow strip of land, and the peninsula had hills, so it was a very good defensive position. And finally, there was arable land near the site of Carthage, which could support a large population. The result of this favorable location, the intensity of trade, because Carthage was about halfway between Spain and Phoenicia, near important islands like Sardinia and Sicily, and on top of that, a flow of Phoenicians willing to move to colonies, was that instead of staying small at a few hundred inhabitants like other colonies, Carthage grew exponentially in the 8th and 7th centuries BC. In 1 century, its population had increased from 0 to 30,000 people, a high number for the time. And meanwhile, its mother city Tyre was declining in the 7th century, especially as a consequence of the wars with the Babylonians. Tyre was besieged several times during this period. So, even though the inhabitants of Carthage remained very Phoenician in their culture, they were so successful and able to stand on their own that they started to identify as citizens of Carthage rather than citizens of Tyre. Contrary to other colonies that lived mainly from trade, Carthage had diversified. It also transformed a lot of raw materials and sold its own crafts. It produced a lot of food, and it had become a trade hub between Africa and the Mediterranean world. It could offer luxury goods like ivory, ostrich eggs and feathers, gold, plenty of food, and wine. The Carthaginians developed a Punic culture. Punic is the Latin equivalent of the Greek term Phoenician. Punic culture is the name of this Western Phoenician culture that developed far from Phoenicia. For example, certain deities became more important in Carthage. Others from Greece were also worshipped in the city, like Demeter, the Greek goddess of agriculture. It is also possible that Carthage retained Phoenician religious practices that had fallen out of favor in Tyre, like child sacrifices. This is uncertain. Historians still not agree whether the Carthaginians practiced them or not. So, bit by bit, Carthage was diverging, becoming independent from a mother city that did not have the means, or maybe even the desire, to keep it under control. By the middle of the 7th century BC, Carthage was so independent that it embarked on its own colonization process. And in the 6th century, Tyre and other Phoenician cities had submitted to the Persian Empire. They were incorporated into it, So Carthage was formally an independent power at this point. Another trait that distinguished Carthage from other Phoenician cities was that quickly Carthage had different and more ambitions. It had an affinity for maritime trade, like all Phoenician cities, but also for imperial and military expansion. Contrary to Byblos, Tyre, or Sidon, it engaged in territorial conquest. It became an expansionist power. It is unknown exactly why this happened in Carthage and in no other Phoenician city. For example, near Carthage there was another Phoenician colony, Utica, which was much older and had the same advantages. But Utica never embarked on such a project. Maybe it came down to a few influential individuals in Carthage, or events we don't know of. Or another theory is that Carthage received a lot of refugees from Phoenicia, fleeing the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests. They may have understood that the Phoenician model of being only a maritime power, with a small population and not much land, was very fragile and always at risk with large land empires as neighbors. At the time, the Greeks or the Etruscans were influent in the western Mediterranean Sea. They also had small states or city-states, but with larger territories than Phoenician states, and this threatened the Phoenician trade monopoly. And finally, domestic politics in Carthage may have been a factor. Very little is known of Carthaginian politics before the 3rd century BC, when wars with Rome began. But the throne of Carthage in the 6th century BC was occupied by a king, King Mago I, who was a general, and he developed the land army of Carthage with regular soldiers and mercenaries. His successors, who were from the same dynasty, continued this policy. So from the 6th to the 4th centuries BC, Carthage kept growing as a city, but more importantly annexed other Phoenician colonies in the western Mediterranean and conquered more land to administrate it directly. It occupied the coast of North Africa, from Morocco in the west to Libya in the east, plus Sardinia, Malta, the Balearic Islands, half of Sicily, and the south of Spain. Of course, this rise implied more neighbors and clashes with foreign powers. In Italy there was a young rising power at the time, the Roman Republic, which was expanding from central Italy. But the time of war had not arrived yet. In 509 BC, at the end of the 6th century, Carthage and Rome signed a treaty that demarcated their spheres of influence. The two states had different approaches to their expansion. The Carthaginians were still very oriented towards maritime control and trade. They favored the control of coastal regions mainly, whereas Rome was more a land power. The Romans wanted to exploit the mainland, and their navy was secondary to their army. These were two different cultures, and the heritage of Phoenicia influenced Carthage a great deal here, but also a product of necessity. the Romans had direct neighbors in the north and south of Italy that could threaten them, whereas the city of Carthage was not close to any enemy that could attack by land. So in the 5th and 4th centuries, Rome and Carthage avoided war, and each kept growing. But the one conflict that could not be avoided for Carthage was with the Greeks. The different Greek cities too had many colonies in Western Mediterranean, and this put them in direct competition with Carthage. The biggest stake in this rivalry was Sicily, which was half Carthaginian in the west and half Greek in the east. The most important Greek city in Sicily was Syracuse, and in 480 BC, the tyrant, the ruler of Syracuse, Gallo I, attempted to unite Sicily, under his rule obviously, with the backing of other Greek city-states. The word tyrant in modern English is rather negative, pejorative. It is a kind of cruel dictator. But the original Greek term only meant absolute monarch, someone who ruled without constitutional power. For much of ancient Greece, it was just a neutral term, just something factual. But it changed later, during classical Greece, when several Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle defined the tyrant as a person who rules without law, using extreme and cruel measures. This is when the term began to become negative. But returning to 480 BC, this ruler of Syracuse launched his conquest of Sicily by attacking other Greek colonies. And the threat to Carthaginian holdings in the west was quite obvious. So Carthage intervened, and an expedition was sent to Sicily, led by the king, King Hamilcar, from the same dynasty as Mago, the king who had begun to transform the Carthaginian army. The expedition was a big failure for Carthage. Hamilcar lost some of his army on the way to Sicily due to poor weather, and then when the two armies met, the Greeks won a decisive victory. Hamilcar died, so there was a power vacuum in Carthage, and the nobles of the city sued for peace. After this war, Carthage was left with only a marginal presence on the coast of Sicily. But the most important consequence was a political turning point. Monarchy disappeared, and the elite of nobles and traders created an oligarchic republic in Carthage, a model closer to the Roman Republic, in which assemblies of noble and common people had the power to constrain their rulers. Despite this big political change, it was only a setback for Carthage, and the losses in Sicily were compensated with more territories conquered in Spain and North Africa. In the 5th century BC, Carthaginian navigators went even further outside the Mediterranean Sea. They passed the Strait of Gibraltar between Europe and Africa. They were not the first ones. This region had been mapped for centuries, but they went further than their predecessors. To the north, they explored the Atlantic coast of Europe, and to the south, along the coast of Africa, they went as far south as Senegal, which is quite far. For comparison, the Spanish and Portuguese navigators of the Middle Ages did not dare to go that far south. And it is only 2000 years later, in the 15th century, that the Portuguese dared to go as far. The Carthaginians never managed to reconquer all of Sicily. They tried again, a second Sicilian war 70 years later after the first one, and a century later there was a third one, but it always ended in status quo. The big challenge was yet to come. Despite all its wealth and its undisputed control of the western Mediterranean Sea, a new great power was rising to the north, the Roman Republic. By the beginning of the 3rd century BC, Rome had expanded too. It had secured its frontiers to the north of Italy. It had gained territories towards the south too, and Rome was definitely an expansionist power. So was Carthage, and the western Mediterranean was not large enough for both. Carthage, the city, had reached an impressive size at this point. I told you earlier that the city had 30,000 inhabitants in the 7th century BC. In the 3rd century BC, 400 years later, it now had 500,000. These are just estimates, but they give an order of magnitude. This made Carthage not only the largest city in the Mediterranean world at the time, but possibly in the world. There are very few contemporary descriptions of the city itself. We know it had powerful walls, dozens of mansions, of palaces for wealthy traders and nobles. It had temples, probably public buildings like public baths, and very busy markets everywhere. The port was huge. There are many descriptions of the countless commercial vessels that the Carthaginians owned, probably hundreds, and they were renowned from Italy to Greece to even Phoenicia and the Middle East for their mercantile skills and their wealth. But Carthage was not just a mercantile culture. It had also put a lot of emphasis on agriculture, which was less rooted in Phoenician culture. On miles and miles around the city, there was a considerable number of farms, of orchards and vineyards, with large private estates that travelers from Rome and Greek cities have described. The Carthaginians had a very rich material culture. They consumed not only the luxury goods they produced, but goods coming from far away, from the Middle East, Greece, even sub-Saharan Africa on the other side of the Sahara. As we are going to see, they lost the first war with Rome, and after that they embraced agriculture and industry even more as a way of compensating for some of the overseas territories they had lost. What triggered the war with Rome was a military intervention that Carthage made in Sicily, after which Carthaginian forces were present in the Strait of Messina, which is the very narrow channel between continental Italy and Sicily. This put Carthage closer than ever to Roman interests on the continent in Italy, and the Romans reacted immediately by attacking the Carthaginians, which started the First Punic War. That is to say, the first war between Rome and Carthage, and this was in 264 BC. Both powers were at the height of their power at the time. Carthage probably had an advantage in navy and wealth, whereas Rome had more manpower and a very organized and effective land army, which the Carthaginians tried to compensate with mercenaries. This first Punic War lasted for more than 20 years, not 20 years of continuous battles. It took time to send expeditions. The Romans managed to land in Africa, but they were repelled, whereas Carthage had victories on the sea. But after this, Carthage suffered a string of defeats that forced it to sue for peace. And to make things even worse, it was faced with a large mutiny of troops that it employed, and the uprisings of settlements in Africa. So there was a kind of civil war, and when it ended, and Carthage could stabilize its situation, the city had a huge indemnity to pay to Rome, and the Romans had used the events of this mercenary war to seize Corsica and Sardinia. This first war had weakened Carthage temporarily, but not destroyed it at all. Actually, it rebuilt itself, it rebuilt what had been destroyed, and restored its wealth. So, even though Rome had gained a bit of ground, the dispute was far from settled. 20 years of armed peace followed, but clearly one of the two powers needed to go. Animosity grew on both sides again, and in 218 BC, a second war started, which also lasted for a long time, 17 years, and is the most famous of these Punic Wars because it saw spectacular action and threatened the existence of Rome itself. At the start of the war, the Romans had Italy, Sardinia, and Corsica, and they had reinforced their navy. The Carthaginians had Iberia, Spain, as their main pool of manpower, and their army was very diverse. It came from various parts of North Africa, with also Spaniards, ethnic Phoenicians, a very large cavalry composed for a large part of Numidians, a people of North Africa who had a reputation for being very good horsemen. Numidia was located in what is the east of Algeria today. The Carthaginians also even had North African elephants, a species of elephants that went extinct during the antiquity, that they used as assault units and also for their psychological impact. They were terrifying to infantrymen who made the bulk of antique armies. The most famous episode of this war is the surprise journey of the Carthaginian commander-in-chief, Hannibal, with an army of tens of thousands by land from Spain to Italy, which implied crossing the Alps by surprise, a move that looked impossible for such a large army and its elephants, but that Hannibal achieved. He entered northern Italy, helped by Gaulish allies, and won several victories against the Romans, including one of the largest battles of the antiquity, the Battle of Canaan, in which the Romans were crushed despite their higher numbers. When they saw this, several allies of Rome switched side and went with Carthage. Hannibal was in Italy, and the situation looked critical for the Romans. But it didn't look that good either for Hannibal, because his army suffered from attrition as time passed, and the war in Italy lasted a decade during which the Romans refused to concede, and instead they used their large manpower pool and everything they had to field always more armies. The Romans were also better at siegecraft, and they could recapture the cities faster than Hannibal could take them. They could manage at the same time to more or less control Hannibal in Italy and send an expedition led by General Scipio Africanus, to Spain, and end Carthage's control over it while Hannibal was still in Italy. The final showdown took place near Carthage at the Battle of Zama, where the Romans, led again by Scipio, defeated the Carthaginians. The war was lost for Carthage, and the Romans imposed a very harsh peace, first because they always intended Carthage to disappear as a great power, and second for retribution, because this war had caused major devastation in Italy, and there had been a time, a few years earlier, before the victory, when the Romans could have been completely destroyed. If Hannibal had been successful at taking Rome, Carthage could have been at the dawn of another period of expansion, and the Roman Empire may never have existed. It is impossible to know, but in any case, the Roman victory in this war turned Rome into the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean. Rome gained all Carthaginians' possessions, especially Spain, and Carthage was left as almost a Roman client state, with only its North African territory. After the Second Punic War, Carthage was still a large city, but the basis of its prosperity, its commercial network, its navy, which had been confiscated, its manpower, it was all gone. There was a Third Punic War, 50 years later, in which the Romans essentially finished Carthage. This war was supported by a group of hawkish Roman senators for political and imperialist reasons. Carthage still had attractive agricultural land in North Africa. There was still wealth to seize, and it was a profitable but low-risk operation for Rome. A pretext was found when Carthage was attacked by Numidia, an ally of Rome, and Rome intervened in support of its ally, in reality to take what remained of Carthaginian land and totally destroy the ghost of the biggest threat to Rome that had ever existed. After a long siege, Carthage was taken and completely destroyed in 146 BC. The last Phoenician political power had disappeared. We had left Phoenicia in the east of the Mediterranean Sea when the Persians had annexed the various cities or subjugated them. But even though they were part of the Persian Empire, these cities could retain their Phoenician culture and keep existing as commercial powers under the Persians. But their independence was gone forever. After the Persians came the invasion by Alexander the Great, by the Greeks, and Phoenicia was one of the first regions he conquered. In Alexander's empire, and later its successor in Lebanon and Syria, the Seleucid kingdom or empire, after Seleucus, one of Alexander's generals, Phoenician culture increasingly mixed with Greek culture. And after that, in the 1st century arrived the Romans, that turned Phoenicia into one of their provinces. Phoenician culture continued to dissolve under Romanization, to the point of going extinct and no longer being distinguishable. The province was part of the Roman Empire for centuries, first of the whole empire, and then the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium. During this period, the old religion was abandoned, and Christianization progressed, until the 7th century, when the Muslim Arabs invaded the region, and a process of Islamization and Arabization started. At this point, Phoenician civilization was long gone already, after centuries of being masters of the sea and leaving an important mark on human civilization. We have reached the end of our story for tonight. You can now let go and fall asleep, or pick another story from my library if you want. Sleep well. Sweet dreams. Au revoir.